Alright, as with last time, I put the next episode of the animation tier list up for a vote to my patrons, YouTube members, and Twitch subs. The winner was back air, and as with all of these, we're looking at absolutely everything to do with the animation. How impactful is it? How well executed is it technically? How creative is it? Sound design is included as well. Everything. These videos take a lot of work to create, so if you find yourself enjoying this one and think it deserves to be passed around more, please consider leaving a like and comment. That's a huge factor YouTube's algorithm uses. Alright, let's do it. Let's start off this time with one of the better known back airs in the series, Jigglypuff. So first off, I'm just going to say right away, I kind of hate that they made it turn you around in Ultimate. You know, it kind of makes you face the opposite direction like, say, Marth and Lucina's do. It probably wasn't designed to hurt Jigglypuff. I think the idea behind it was that you knock your opponent off stage and then you can use your Nair and your Fair as edge guarding tools, but I think the end result was a bit more of a detriment considering how much Jigglypuff fishes for this thing. That's more of a gameplay concern though. In terms of the actual move itself, so back air, it looks very weak in comparison to how powerful the actual move is, and usually I take some serious points off for that, but in the case of Jigglypuff, you know, I actually think it kind of suits her. It feels appropriate for her design. A lot of her moves are this more like swatty, casual nature despite hitting fairly hard, and because she's such an extreme character design, you know, the balloon Pokemon, it's more of like an almost push through you kind of thing that she's doing as opposed to the more traditional like hit you hard right away kind of deal. So I think I actually don't mind it. Slow motion, and as a reminder, what actually matters in gameplay is the animation at full speed and full scale, but you can learn some interesting stuff through these. I do like Jigglypuff's dangly feet at the end of the animation here. They just kind of casually fold back into position. This is the first set of aerials in the series, which means we also need to look at the landing animations for these. Some of these can get pretty creative. In the case of Jigglypuff in particular, nothing too special about it. Yeah. Looks stable enough, and I do like that there's still some of that floatiness maintained. She doesn't look like she's hitting the ground that hard. And then the actual impact test. It feels really nice to connect with, actually. So one thing I should clear up here, you may notice that I'm not going to be showing absolutely every impact test in this video. That was something I was doing a little bit before, but I'm going to start doing it more often for ones that don't change my mind at all. And that's actually something I was doing for other aspects of character animations too. I noticed I'm getting comments like, why didn't you test the charged version of Mii Sword Fighter's blurring blade? Or why didn't you test the recoil animation if you hit Ridley during his plasma breath? And the reality is I did, and they didn't really do anything for me, so I just cut them out of the video. It felt very obvious to me, but it seems like it's actually not that obvious to a lot of viewers, which in retrospect, fair enough, so just a heads up, I am doing that. I'm also probably going to try and be at least a little bit more consistent with what gets cut out too, less stuff that I think people are likely to ask about. Jigglypuff, I think, starts the list off with a solid A tier here. There are very few characters who could get away with a move that feels so floaty yet hits so hard. I think she does qualify. Let's do the other pink ball here, Kirby. I kind of love this one, actually. It feels really impactful and quick, and this is a very strong back air again, a surprisingly strong back air. You know, I gotta attach the obvious caveat that back airs in general are often one of a character's strongest moves, but this one really does hit hard, and it feels like it. Kirby's a very small character, but because he's so pliable and elastic, he really can get a great feeling of force generated. Is it anything particularly special? Like, not really, but I do like the pose. You can see at full extension there's this great sense of coordination among Kirby's entire body here. His feet are moving forward, but his hand is left behind and his body is still following along with his feet, so you get this really nice exaggerated elongation. And again, because Kirby is elastic, you see him bounce back really convincingly and satisfyingly afterwards. Works really well in slow motion as well, and I really like that little flip he does right at the end there to bring himself back into the air state. And then the landing animation is relatively straightforward. I do like how he catches himself there with his hand, but you can barely even see it because Kirby is just so stubby, but he does flatten his entire body like a pancake. I think that's kind of funny. See it one more time there. Yeah. I think another A tier for this one. It's a very simple animation, intentionally simple, and it's not bringing anything like mind-blowing to the table, but everything about it is executed very well. Let's get a slightly nastier take on that backwards kick, Ridley. Ridley was a character they obviously had a little bit of difficulty fitting into Smash in general, and I think stuff like this just, I don't know, it kind of matches him. He is using his talons if you bring that into slow or up close. Yeah, let's do slow motion as well. It does look like a fairly vicious kick, which has got going in its favor, but it just doesn't really seem like something that I would picture Ridley doing so much. I don't know about this one. I know Ridley's not a dumb beast. He's actually supposedly very intelligent, at least if you listen to some parts of the Metroid canon, but like this thing here, it looks too human. Like, that just looks like a human model that they kind of transplanted onto this scary lizard thing. Like, it doesn't fit him. Even with the sacrifices they needed to make for Smash, Ridley has a very interesting body shape, right? He's got those really huge, intimidating jaws. His front claws are really scary. The tail, the wings, honestly, his back legs are the most conventional, least intimidating part of him. And back airs tend to be some of the character's scariest, most intimidating moves. I just feel like there's a bit of a disconnect here. It does hit hard, but even then, it kind of doesn't feel like it's hitting nearly as hard as it actually does. It just looks kind of stiff. Even on contact, it still looks a little bit stiff. His leg sticks way out behind him, but the rest of his body isn't quite joining in the same way. Like, I feel like his torso could be leaned way further down. It's just not quite cutting it. And then the landing animation. That's actually pretty well done. Actually, that's my favorite part of this entire thing. You do really feel the weight of Ridley coming down there. Probably not the best sign if the animation ending is the part of it I enjoy the most. Yeah, you know, I was kind of thinking before I started this it was going to be somewhere like in the B, C tier range, but I actually think this is going in F. Ridley's got so much potential with his animations, and I don't think they quite nailed it all the time in Ultimate, and I think this is one of the worst examples for me. Too many kicks. Let's get away from kicks for a bit, and yeah, there are going to be a lot of kicks in this video. That's just how it's going to go, but let's do Shulk. There's a lot of these sword coverage kind of moves in the game, but generally speaking, they tend to be slashes a lot more often than their stabs, and this is a very heavy feeling stab, and it's got some creativity behind it. It honestly feels very satisfying to use. Look at Shulk's left hand in particular here. He doesn't just hold the Monado normally, he actually puts his hand on the pommel so he can get as much thrust behind it as he possibly can, and I love the Monado splitting animation. I think it's so simple and elegant. Like, man, that feels really chunky. Reads nicely on this side too, and look at his legs. Like, his front leg there kicks up basically a straight 90 degrees. He is throwing his body behind that one. This is nicely done. Yeah, the wind up into it too, his legs actually split really far apart and then do that nice aggressive kick. Good stuff. Landing animation. Yeah. It's a little jittery. They're always going to be a little bit jittery because there's only one animation that they need to catch like a lot of different states of the animation with. But for what it is, I think that landing on one knee kind of approach fits the move pretty well. And then impact feels good too. Now, I'm going to say the sound effect of the Monado by itself sounds great. I think when you combine it with a little bit more of the just generic hit sound, it does lose a little bit there. I feel like a bit more distinctive sound effect would have been appreciated, but it's not that necessary. And then I've had some requests to test these with the different Monado arts.
Smash! Buster! Shield!
Yeah, they honestly don't really change anything for me. I don't think I'm going to do that with other moves in this series. Yeah, that'll be the first S tier of the video. It's one of the more memorable sword moves, and the technical execution on it's fantastic. And then Pyra/Mythra, why not? I am recording this on the day of a Xenoblade Direct, which I have not watched and probably will not watch because I do not care about Xenoblade. Xenoblade animations, on the other hand, have generally had a pretty good track record on this series so far. Yeah, another very creative take on the sword stab, like a full-on backflip arc up behind you thing. We haven't really seen anything like this before. I will say, I do think it suits Mythra better than Pyra because this is not an incredibly powerful feeling animation. The issue with it is that the sword starts low and goes up, so it's fighting against gravity. Now, Mythra is the combo character among them, so I think this actually suits it pretty well. When you're trying to tell me that this is a really nasty kill move though, even with the extra wind-up time, I'm not quite buying it the same way. It doesn't help that she's not really selling the power of it that convincingly. She is tucking in a lot, which lets you rotate faster. That's the same principle that real-life gymnasts and things along those lines would use, but it kind of looks a little bit more like just sort of holding your arm out and letting your body rotate. The landing post behind this one's pretty good though. It's got a little bit of elegance behind it, but still landing fairly hard. Actually kind of suits the characters. You know, they're somewhat graceful sword fighters, but they're not like the most graceful we've ever seen in the series. It's certainly not like they're above just wailing on you. Mythra, yeah, I think the wind-up works substantially better here because that extra wind-up time that Pyra gets is not in a pose that really even looks like it's winding up into all that much. Just sort of getting it over with as quickly as possible seems more like what this animation is suited for. I will say for both these characters, it looks much better on this side as opposed to this side where the hair starts getting in the way. Like, yeah, it loses some readability there. That's not fantastic, especially on Mythra because she's got the longer hair. With Pyra, it's not nearly as bad, but I'm still going to say it loses something. Here, it's very open, it's very clean, much more readable. And then, as expected, Mythra does the same landing pose and it looks good here too. Impact for Pyra is more of a kill move. Yeah. Like, it doesn't feel that great to hit with. It's not the most powerful kill move in her kit by any means, so that's not the end of the world. It's not supposed to feel as powerful as some other tools she has, but even taking that into account, it's far from my favorite, with Mithra as more of a combo tool. That works way better for me. Mithra, I think, goes all the way up in S tier. That's another very well executed, very memorable take on the sword sweep behind you idea. Pyra, I actually think all the way down in B, though. I really don't think this suits her anywhere near as well. These two characters with very different roles to perform had to largely share the same animations, and generally speaking, I think they were very smartly chosen, like the frameworks they went with. This one, not so much. It was a bit of a miss for me. Something a bit different again. Pokemon Trainer. Squirrel's got a fun concept behind this one, the tail twirling thing. Very simple, makes sense with his design though, and I love the line he draws. Like his entire body just flattens into one really clean straight line. It's got a nice flow to it, and you do get a bit of that feeling of extension at the beginning. It does look like he's actively shoving his tail into you rather than just kind of passively spinning around and bringing his entire body over. Keeps a gleeful expression on his face right up until that very final determined finisher pose. I appreciate that. Squirtle's always got some great facial animations on him. The landing animation is a straight up wipeout, which makes sense because, hey, Squirtle's just kind of putting his entire body into it. What is he gonna do but land hard? And then, of course, the impact on this isn't very heavy, but it's a combo tool. It's not really supposed to be. And I actually think landing it still does feel pretty fun. And then Ivysaur, I really like the motion smears on this one. That's the first thing I noticed. Just very bright and vibrant. They pierce through everything, very readable. Definitely a bit more of a lazy feeling to this one than there is with Squirtle, but when you consider the fact that this is once again more of a combo tool than a kill move, and that Ivysaur is generating way more power just by the virtue of how long these vine whips are in comparison to anything Squirtle has access to, and the fact that Ivysaur in general, it kind of fits the character's personality a bit. A lot of their animations feel like a little bit more, you know, laid back. This is kind of the zoner character of the gang. Actually, once again, really don't mind that. I think it fits in okay. Landing animation. Yeah, this one's actually not that good. Ivysaur is doing a full flip here. It seems like it should be hitting the ground fairly hard, and it's just kind of not. It's a little bit of almost, actually kind of an awkward feeling, just instant bump off. I really like the sound of the vines whipping through the air. And then on impact, again, not supposed to be a powerful hit, but I think for what it is, it's not too bad. I will say maybe on impact, the kind of stiff look of the vines gets in the way just a little bit. Like, obviously, they're not going to put in dynamic interaction. Like, if it hits Marth, I'm not necessarily expecting the vines to, you know, bend against his body or anything like that. That seems like a bit of an unrealistic ask. I guess maybe just the concept of the move was inevitably going to have a little bit of this problem. It's not that big a deal, realistically, though. Then Charizard. So, attacking with his tail makes total sense, and this is one of the most powerful back airs in the entire game. I will say, considering how strong it is, it does maybe seem like he swings his tail a little bit slowly, but the other side of that is that it's made up for it to a degree because that tipper effect is just so well indicated by the flame. So not only is it a great little bit of diegetic indication from a gameplay perspective, but it also means that the animation is kind of enhanced because you're hitting them with a bright flame. Of course, it seems stronger. It's important they nailed the landing pose of this one because you're going to be seeing it a lot. Charizard usually ends up stuck in it. You can see it's fairly good. It does look reasonably strong, and Charizard remains relatively composed throughout the entire thing. He looks very sturdy, so that's kind of the trade-off, I suppose, for letting his tail stay a little bit more under control. It means that he himself doesn't need to go out of control nearly as much. The impact for this one is relatively strong, even with the sour spot. Like you can hear, that's not a particularly light sound effect they're using there. As far as sour spots go, it's not a particularly weak one, but obviously, the main strength of this move is the tipper sweet spot with the tail. Yeah, and they're using like that heavy flame, and it fits this one really well. Squirtle, A tier. Actually think this one's a lot of fun. Ivysaur, I think this one's more of a B tier. A few things I really like about it, a few nitpicks. And then Charizard, maybe a little bit controversial on this one. I'm not totally sure, but I'm actually putting that one in B tier too. Back airs are powerful. If you want to proclaim like, yeah, I'm one of the strongest back airs among them all, you need to really sell that, and I feel like this animation doesn't quite get there. There are other ones sort of in its weight class, so to speak, that I just think do it better. Let's do the attacking with critters on your back package. So we got Duck Hunt, we got Banjo, and depending on how you want to look at things, Corrin. Duck Hunt, the concept behind this character is pretty cool, the duck attacking for the dog a lot of the time. I feel like this is not my all-time favorite use of it, but the one detail that I do like is how the duck kind of just flaps back into position. That's actually really smoothly done. You can see it in slow motion here. Actually, the tandem attack between the two of them is fairly nice, even if it's the duck that's really doing more of the actual attacking. The dog is getting into it. Then yeah, I like that smooth flat back, the feathers falling off as it goes. It's pretty well done for what it is. It actually even circles all the way around the dog a little bit. Yeah. Expression on the dog's face is great, not nearly so much on the duck. It's not nearly as expressive. It's a semi-realistic duck. What are you necessarily expecting there? Yeah, you know what? Actually, the more I watch this one, the more I find myself liking it. Now, what happens if you land before the duck actually manages to get back onto his back? Okay, it doesn't really seem to change all that much, actually. Okay, so I'm gonna do an attempt here where I land just as the move is coming out. So the duck just kind of pops into position there. Okay, now what if I time it so the duck is almost in position just as the dog is landing? Let's try here. So, okay, duck comes out. He's circling back around. He's almost back in position. And you still trigger the landing. Okay, so he actually does just do a little bit of a snap. But because of the way the duck's arc is designed, it actually doesn't look too unnatural. The duck actually has a decent amount of airtime in the recovery animation, but because it's sort of this kind of motion around the dog, his horizontal position relative to the camera actually stays fairly consistent, and his vertical travel isn't that insane either, and that means any kind of snaps back into position actually don't look too bad. They look fairly smooth. It's a clever approach. A tier, I think. This one's fun. Banjo, concept behind this one is kind of clever. It's not my all-time favorite thing they do with Kazooie here, but what really brings it home for me is just Banjo's pose here. Like everything else he does, he puts himself into it fully. I love the little bit of almost concern he gets on his face as Kazooie's pecking out, and then Kazooie herself, she's going hard. Interesting trajectory too, down, up, middle. You might expect a little bit more of a sweeping sort of deal, but this actually makes sense to me because it sort of averages out in your eye at full speed where it's done so fast that it just kind of indicates, here's the danger area. You can see like you can barely even pick out the details of the individual pecks. It's almost just a blur. Landing animation for this one is fairly straightforward. You can see that Kazooie kind of eats dust there. Banjo, he's fine. He just kind of lands on his shoulder and hit. He's all right. They're cartoon characters. They don't need to look like they're hitting the ground incredibly hard. I will say, compared to some other animations, Kazooie in particular, she seems like she could be a little bit more put off by just, you know, her chin smacking into the ground like that. You do see some stuff like that in Banjo-Kazooie's moveset. Not the most powerful sounding. Again, this is not a killing back air. Now, the vocalizations, as always, are fantastic. Everything else, kind of whatever. I think A tier for this one. It's fun. Banjo and Kazooie are fantastically animated characters overall. This is not my all-time favorite of theirs, though. And then Corrin. So, obligatory complaint about the headgear. I do not like this headpiece. You will always hear me complain about it, but I will say, at the very least in this case, this is kind of one of the times where it lines up better. The silhouette doesn't look completely awful, and it does actually have a nice bit of flow to it with the wings. Everything else about this, I think, is really cool. I love the way this animation is handled. It feels so forceful. Like, wings are relatively thin, right? But this still feels like it's got some real impact behind it, which, considering how hard it hits, makes sense to me. And I love that extra just a little bit of push you get. It makes this feel really good and really credible. It feels like this is exactly how Corrin should be reacting here. It's not the most incredible pose I've ever seen, but you can see there is some effort put towards leaning into it and throwing her back into the wings. I don't know, I feel like she could be going into it maybe a little bit more, but there's another thing to consider with this one. You actually need to be maintaining somewhat of a sense of aerodynamics because obviously their wings, you need to look at least a little like you're on balance, and so from that perspective, I actually think it's okay. The cape just kind of popping back into existence is a little bit ugly. Yeah, that's not great, but generally speaking, if you're looking at this at full gameplay scale, that's not even really going to show up, who cares? Yeah. Landing animation for this one is actually surprisingly mundane, and I don't like how the wings kind of snap back to one fixed position. You can see there, they were almost completely retracted, and then they actually had to snap back out a bit because that's just what the animation is hard-coded to look like. Same the other way around, you'll see that they just kind of abruptly shoot in there. I do like the fact that the wings flap a little bit though, and it's not that big a deal again at full scale, although I'm still gonna say it does actually show up a little bit. You don't necessarily notice it in that kind of detail, and look, it looks more just like flailing almost. Yeah, like just kind of a little bit of awkward motion right at the end. Not fantastic. Impact. Yeah, feels really good. So again, wings are kind of a thinner material, and it's not using the heaviest sound effects. They're more like bladey, cutting sound effects than really punchy ones. And yet you still always buy the fact that this is a kill move. I think this goes in S tier, and just barely. I was debating between A and S tier for this one. There are certainly some things I could pick apart if I wanted to, but pretty creative concept for a move, and it's executed relatively well. Captain Falcon, and this is one of the animations that Ganondorf still shares with him somewhat, so we'll put him up there too. Captain Falcon's back fist. This really suits what they're going for with him in Smash. It's very like martial artsy, but it's one of the more masculine ways to attack someone with a martial art, you know, rather than just doing a straight up punch if you're going to go that route. And then he's still got like that action hero posing going on at the end of the thing, and he holds the move out for a lot longer than necessary, a lot longer than the hitbox is active for, because it's a pose. That's clearly what they're aiming for here. And it's a clean pose too. Leads into it with a nice solid rotation. He lifts his legs up and torques his hips to let the fist get more power behind it. It's pretty well done. Landing animation for this one makes sense too. You can see he's always looking relatively stable and in control, which sometimes I do think takes away from the sense of power a move has, but this is an action hero pose once again. He's never really out of control, and it still sells the power in the air, so I don't really mind if it still looks controlled and poised on the ground. I think S tier for this one. It's simple, but it's simple in a way that hits all the right beats, you know what I mean? This is the kind of move that can become classic, not the move that's just simple because it's uninspired and boring. This is obviously still a Captain Falcon copy, and Ganondorf in general, we all know he's not very well represented in comparison to how he appears in Zelda. I will say, as far as the remaining Falcon clone moves in his kit, this is one of the ones I could actually kind of see showing up in a Zelda title. From a canon perspective, it's obviously not good, but it's far from the most egregious example in Ganondorf's kit either. You can see the poses even considerably more wound up and exaggerated than Captain Falcon goes into, which, considering this is one of the strongest back airs in the entire game, makes sense. And it actually looks pretty good. Definitely looks stiffer than Captain Falcon, but that's kind of par for the course with Ganondorf, and a little bit of awkward leg torquing if you look at it in slow motion like this, but that does sell the power of the move a fair amount, and if you look at it in more of a standard scale, it maybe looks like you can see it a little bit, but I think it sells it reasonably well. Landing animation definitely hits the ground a lot heavier than Captain Falcon does, which makes sense for Ganondorf. Yeah, you can see there's actually kind of a weird pop in his hips there. Okay, that's not that good. But you kind of tend to forget about a lot of that stuff when you actually hit someone with this thing. Yeah, don't absolutely love the sound effect there. Ganondorf is one of the few characters who gets access to that, like, hitting you in a reverberating arena kind of thing. And I do think that back air would be one of the moves that would warrant this. I actually think they should use that sound effect more overall across the roster, but Ganondorf's back air, I think it should definitely be on the list. A lot lighter moves than that one also get that same kind of almost snappy kind of punch. Still, I think this one can just kind of go into A tier. It makes more sense than a lot of his Falcon clone stuff, and it's got some flaws, absolutely, but it feels really good to connect with, and that counts for a lot. Villager and Isabelle. So first thing I need to figure out is whether there's actually any substantial difference between them. And I'm gonna say, like, no, not really. Like, sure, their legs are in vaguely different positions, but generally speaking, these animations are handled pretty much the same. And that largely applies to their landing animations as well. Certainly nothing substantial enough to make me change a tier placing, so I'm just gonna do Villager. So maybe a little bit lame that his forward air here and his back air both share the slingshot, but at the same time, you know, I kind of get the decision. It means that you're a little bit more consistent with your threat range regardless of which direction you're facing, and they do act a little bit different. The back air is more powerful, the forward air is a little bit quicker. I do not play Villager, so I'm terrible at these timings, but I do like that they don't have him do the exact same thing. So his forward air here, you can see that's pretty much what you'd expect a slingshot to look like. His back air, yeah, he doesn't just like turn around and do the same thing, he actually does like a sneaky launch behind him kind of deal. And it does fit. I like the snappiness of the string as well. That looks great. That looks very convincing. And because the orbs are so large, they should be really convincing power moves, because this thing can be surprisingly powerful, so you'd think that would sell it well. The issue is the power only really comes in if you're really close to your opponent, like too close for the orbs to really stand out that much. Although at the very least, they are exaggerated enough to serve as reasonable visual indicators, you know, to be able to see a projectile coming at you. They're still not fantastic. They're a little dark. The motion smears aren't that vibrant or that substantial. They get the job done, but they're not my all-time favorites. The sound of these flying at you are infuriating. I know they probably did that on purpose. I know it's taken out of Animal Crossing. Still infuriating. And then you can see, like, at the range where you actually might expect the size of the pebbles to come into play or the orbs to come into play, actually not very strong. And then if you're close enough so that this does act as a kill move, is almost a completely different thing you need to evaluate. Like, you barely even have time to notice that it's a projectile attack at all. This is around max range for it, which is comparable to some of the longer melee range back airs in the game. I think I can give kind of a reluctant A tier to these ones. The concept behind them is fairly creative. This is definitely one of the more memorable back airs in the game. Technical execution is pretty strong. I don't love them, and I'm not really even sure why I'm putting them in A tier, but I can't really think of all that much reason to bring them lower. Sonic. Okay, we're going to be looking at a lot of this kind of move today. Even by the time of Brawl, when Sonic was introduced though, this was already kind of a stale move concept. There's sort of mixed feelings for me for this one in particular though. So I like his pose. You can see compared to some other characters, Sonic actually does have a relatively strong, distinct pose there. But it looks a little bit awkward in the wind-up to me, and this move actually hits fairly hard, and I don't think it sells it especially well at speed. He just kind of stops, like a little bit too much. The thing is, this is a little bit more of a hook kick than the back kick or side kick a lot of characters do with similar kinds of moves, which means that for this to be really selling the sense of power, it would need follow-through, and follow-through would mean going through the move, right? So you start here and then you follow through faster, but Sonic doesn't do that. He just stops his foot, and if he can just stop his foot on a dime like that, it means it probably wasn't really traveling that fast and powerfully, right? But if he wants the pose, which is part of what I like about the move, he has to stop there. So there's a bit of kind of mixed priorities on this one. And the end result, I think, is a move that looks cool in some ways, but also feels a little bit awkward and unsure of itself. No strong facial expressions of any kind while he's doing it. I'm not quite sure what that's about. Like, Sonic just does not have that much of a personality. Landing pose is okay. Fits the animation fairly well, I suppose. I can't really say a whole lot else about it, though. Yeah, like I said, we got a lot of these to get through today, and I suspect a lot of them are going to be sort of middle of the pack kind of deals. So if this is one of them, and there are multiple things I can find wrong with it that I don't like as much as a lot of its competitors, I don't really see how I can go higher than C tier. It feels kind of mean at this point. Like, I don't want to be picking on Sonic disproportionately, but I'm also not going to like move him up because I feel like I've picked on him too much in previous videos, you know what I mean? Let's get what I guess would be like the textbook example of that kind of kick in here, me Brawler. Yeah, same kind of deal, right? But this is more of a back kick compared to Sonic's hook kick. It goes out rather than around, and he doesn't hold the pose as long, so it looks, I would say, considerably more powerful. That said, obviously by design, this is very generic. It's supposed to be very generic. Do I give it points for being generic? No, not necessarily, but you know, for what it is, it's a reasonably well done take on that kind of move. It looks convincing. I don't see anything particularly wrong with it. I like that bit of a spin back into position there. That looks good. Landing animation, actually pretty heavy. Yeah, he's really catching himself with that one. And B tier, that's about as straightforward as you're gonna get. Might as well get the other Miis while we're here. Sword Fighter and Gunner. Sword Fighter, again, this is really about as basic and straightforward as sword slash as you could ask for. Nothing standout about it, nothing that really looks particularly off with it. Landing animation, extremely straightforward. It's a sword slash. Gunner, I do appreciate that this one is a little bit more distinctive. It's a bit more of almost like a Captain Falcon-esque kind of move, that back fist. You can see she's even doing a similar pose, but with some of the Samus-inspired cannon fire at the end. Like, this is definitely my favorite of the three of them. Is it my favorite by a significant margin? At the end of the day, it's definitely the most memorable of the three. I would say, yeah, I actually do really prefer this over the other two. Really nice defined silhouette on this one. Now, it does obviously look better on this side where you're facing the camera versus this side where you're not. But I'm gonna say, even on this side, it's still pretty readable overall. Just a little bit of recoil on the gun that goes through and shakes the entire body a bit. Nothing super substantial, but it is enough to get the point across at least. Landing animation is pretty straightforward. Obviously, she's not going to catch herself with the gun barrel there, so the only other thing you could do to sell the sense of impact a little bit would be to put the other hand down. That's not necessary for all of them though. Sword Fighter's getting a C tier because not only is it a generic animation, I don't even think it's a particularly well done generic animation. This is one of me Sword Fighter's kill moves, but it barely even feels like it. It doesn't really feel like he's putting that much force into it. Some of that's just the smaller sword. They inherently feel less powerful because that's how swords work in the real world, but my impression of it is still not particularly great. Gunner actually think goes up in A tier. Like I said, I think this is substantially more interesting than the other Miis. The Pits. This is one that I have gone and looked at in slow motion before. It's a bit of a weird case. It looks okay in context. I actually think it feels pretty satisfying to use in context, but if you really go in and slow it down and look at it, it just seems kind of strange to me. Like, that is a really, really awkward pose. It works, right? Because what he's actually doing is just putting as much force and as much range into the attack as he can, and it is doing that, and you can see his body is really bent over. The end result is just so goofy. This is maximum extension to me, and you can see his arms look like they're just dislocated. Now, I've talked about body breaking before, the act of intentionally pushing a character's joints further than they're supposed to be able to do, which does sell animations more convincingly if done in motion, so it's not really fair to judge them in a paused frame like this. Fair enough. So if I come forward a few frames, this is more like what the actual ending pose of the animation is, and you can see it still looks off. And again, it's a bit of a shame because if you're just throwing this one out, like, that actually does feel pretty good to do. So you can kind of argue that it's fulfilled its role there. This is a bit of a weird one to judge. Landing animation for this one. I like the concept behind it. He needs to snap a little bit too much, I'm gonna say, but the actual pose itself is pretty solid. I'm kind of struggling with these ones. Gameplay feel is good. Is it exceptional? Is it better than a huge chunk of the other back airs on here? You know, I'm gonna say no, so that kind of puts it more into the average tier. The concept is a little bit distinctive, but it's not anything incredibly memorable, and it looks a little bit weirder than a lot of other ones. I feel like I gotta go C tier for these ones. I'll do Palutena as well and wrap up Kid Icarus. I really like this one. I'm just kind of a sucker for the concept of attacking someone with a shield. It's a little bit hard to explain, but I've always liked that idea since like I was a kid. I remember as a kid reading about like the Roman army putting those metal bosses on their shields so they could punch people with them and thinking that was the coolest thing ever. Motion's obviously a little bit different on this one. It's a little bit more of a backhand, or you could almost say like back arm kind of thing, because she does hold her arm fairly stiff and it does feel like she's really connecting with the entire body behind the shield. Landing animation for this one, it works. It's nothing mind-blowing. Palutena is a goddess and she manages to maintain a little bit of a poised appearance, so fair enough. I really like that blunt sound effect they gave this one too. That feels like a lot of fun to hit with. S tier. This is honestly one of my favorite back air animations in the game. I'm just gonna arbitrarily select a handful of these similar backwards kicks and run through them. That'll do for the moment. Fox looks reasonably strong. It's actually not particularly powerful by the standards of this kind of back air, so you could argue that that's a bit of a misleading animation, but generally speaking, as I've mentioned before, I'm not going to tend to dock a lot of points for a move feeling heavier than it actually is. You can see the survivability here. Yeah, that is not as strong as it looks like it should be. In slow motion, it's a bit more of a hook kick animation, but he doesn't hold his foot out there for too long, so it looks okay. There's a bit of awkward shaking in slow motion with the interpolated frames. If you speed that up, though, yeah, that's not really noticeable anymore. Landing animation for this one is actually pretty heavy. Fox really takes a tumble, and considering how high Fox's gravity is, he's the fastest faller in the entire game. That actually suits him pretty well. Falco, a little bit of a stronger pose than Fox does. He does hold his foot out for longer. A little bit more of a straight backwards motion than Fox does. Not too much. I will say that considering this is a substantially stronger move, it really doesn't necessarily look like it. I'm actually going to say, if anything, the animation looks slightly weaker. The pose he ends up in is really strong, though. It sells that aerial ace kind of persona really well. Then the landing animation, again, relatively heavy. It's not nearly as heavy as Fox's, but Falco doesn't fall nearly as fast, and again, he's a little bit more of an aerial character. You expect him to maybe be just slightly more in control. You can see on this side, there's almost a bit of a splits kind of motion, or I guess butterfly would be a better way to describe that. Yeah, works okay. He's still attacking with the ball of his foot, which I would imagine is probably done just to let him extend his foot out further so the move can justify having a larger hitbox. But generally speaking, if you wanted to make a kick like this look as devastating as possible, you would probably attack with the heel. You can see there's definitely no surviving this one. Yeah, Wolf, by far the strongest out of these, and it really does feel like it. Now, giving him extra wind-up frames is cheating. Of course, you can always make it feel like a stronger attack if you let him wind up for longer, but they are put to really good use in this animation. You can see just how far he pulls his leg back and how quickly it shoots out at the end of it there. It looks really convincing. Great pose. Love the way he holds his arm up there. It doesn't result in quite a completely straight line of action, but the thing is, it's a fairly high kick. Having him leaning over enough to sell that might fit, or it might look slightly awkward. I think what they ended up with is very good regardless. His landing animation is not quite the same as his default one, but you can see if I don't do anything, it's reasonably close. A little weird, but staying low to the ground is very much Wolf's thing. He does a similar thing for one of his taunts too. It's okay, it suits the overall direction for him. And yeah, like I said, this is by far the strongest of any of these, and it does feel like it. I love the vocalization there, that grunt, it sells the power a lot more, and that whoosh of air sounds great. Samus, this one feels very fluid to me. I like the kick itself, but on top of that, I also like the axis of rotation she uses to get back into her fall state afterwards. You can see here she has less frames to work with than Wolf does, but she still does that like similar, very exaggerated foot pullback. Her leg doesn't extend out nearly as far as some characters do, by which I mean the knee joint. She's attacking with her heel, so of course her entire leg doesn't go nearly as far. But it still works for me, it still sells the power well. Some of that, again, is probably coming from the heel kick aspect. Some of it is also probably just coming from the fact that she's wearing metal armor, and of course metal feet hit hard. And then Dark Samus, a lot of its animations are fairly distinctive from Samus. This is not one of them. You can see they even have the same landing pose, which is fine. It's a little awkward for both of them, landing on the cannon, but at the same time, that's just kind of an element of Samus's design in general that doesn't really make a lot of sense. If we're being realistic, of course you can't actually get anything done with an arm cannon. What are they gonna do? Zero Suit Samus, this is very much a hook kick. I think it looks a little bit too casual. Yeah, I don't love this one. The rocket heels do help sell its power a little bit, but this is a relatively strong move, and even with those, I'm gonna say it doesn't really look like it too much. I've always found the posing on this one a little bit awkward too. It looks a bit too stiff for Zero Suit Samus, where a lot of her animations are actually very loose and athletic, and you know, her leg actually really doesn't extend out that far at all. There's actually a fair amount of wiggle room to work with here. This is a round full extension. Look at how bent her knee still is. Doesn't get better as she carries through. Landing animation for this one is even a little bit awkward. She does too much of a snap. You can even see it more on this side where her body looks like it just teleports to face the opposite direction. That's actually a bit of an issue she has with some of her other animations as well. I don't get why that's a thing. Donkey Kong, another fairly powerful back air. It's a bit hard to sell the power with those tiny stubby little gorilla feet. I think they're doing a decent job. It helps that I do really like DK's posing here. I do like how much the leg swings too. Like tiny stubby little legs compared to the rest of his body, but they really are trying to generate a sense of momentum, which is especially hard because of how fast this move has to come out. It's frame 7, I think, so actually a relatively quick back air, and they still get a, like, all things considered, more power out of it than they really should be. Landing animation, pretty straightforward for this one, just kind of an sort of deal. Diddy Kong, definitely a little bit more fun than DK's. I like the grin on his face. I like the slightly more expressive hands. I'm gonna say it maybe looks a little bit on the lazy side in comparison to its power, but there is a nice bit of elasticity going on with this one too. I originally thought Diddy might have been holding his hat on his head. That would have been a fun touch. That's not what he's doing. He's actually awkwardly clipping into his hat a bit. Yeah, I don't generally hold clipping against a character too much. That does look a little bit off. I'm gonna say more than anything else, I just prefer my idea of that hand actually holding his hat on. Landing animation. Yeah, it's fine. Incineroar, this is not my favorite of them because, again, it's got a little bit too much of like a swatting feel to it in comparison to its power. He's attacking with his claws rather than his actual feet like most characters do. You can see them extend out there, which is a nice concept, works reasonably well, but the bottom line is that claws like this aren't generally going to hit as hard as, you know, the heel of someone's foot does. I get the swattiness is maybe supposed to look a little more cat-like in general, but, you know, I don't think that quite does enough to justify it for me, and it looks a little bit stiff, even by Incineroar standards. I do know that he's kind of a stiff character to begin with. Doesn't help that the sound effect for it isn't a blade or a claw sound. And yes, that does apply even if you hit it at the very tip. The landing pose does feel pretty good, though. Incineroar is a wrestler character, right? You'd expect some good posing here when he hits the mat, so to speak. And then Sheik's, this is by far my favorite of any of these. I love how snappy it is. I love how strong the silhouette is. This is easily the cleanest silhouette any of these characters have. Her heel is shooting straight back with her entire body behind it, so unlike some of them, this one actually feels much stronger than it is. Do it in slow motion here. Yeah, look at that. That is so exaggerated and so fluid. It sells it so convincingly. Key pose here looks fantastic. This is just great all around. Very classic ninja landing too. Looks convincing and exaggerated, but it also doesn't look like she's hitting the ground overly hard, which Ninja, Fox, B tier, Falco, B tier, Wolf, S tier. I realized I forgot to mention that smooth rotation he does afterwards, which similar to Samus is one of the parts of the move I like more, and that particle effect, I like that too. Samus, A tier, like that one quite a bit. Dark Samus, B tier, despite having essentially or exactly the same animation. Is that a little bit arbitrary and unfair? Maybe, but if all we're getting with Dark Samus differentiator from Samus is the animations, and you're not giving that to me with back air, you're not getting put in the same tier as Samus. DK, B tier. Zero Suit Samus, I think this one's actually going down in F tier. I find it genuinely ugly, and it does not visually match the move's role at all. Definitely my least favorite of any of these. It feels awkward, and it doesn't feel well suited to Zero Suit Samus's kit in particular at all to me. Incineroar, B tier. I think the claws save it, even if there's such a minor detail at full gameplay scale. Regardless of whether they particularly match the animation and sound effects or not, it's still just a cool touch to give a character in general. Diddy Kong, B tier. And then Sheik, I'll give the other S rating to. I really like this one. King K. Rool. Technically speaking, I guess you kind of call this a bit of a rip-off animation. You know, they essentially just took Ganondorf's forward air and stuck it on K. Rool as a back air. But I barely even find myself minding because this is such a cool concept. It just feels so distinct despite the quote-unquote rip-off status, so memorable. I love the fact that it's a spike. I know that's a gameplay thing and it's not actually going to impact the decision, but it's just worth saying anyways. That's awesome. The wind-up on this one looks really good. I love how his entire body gets reoriented so that like the top of his head is facing the camera. The axis his shoulders are rotating on is essentially just 100% in line with the direction the attack's power is traveling in. And forget just the typical expanding a fist a little bit or whatever, they actually make King K. Rool's entire attacking arm way bigger for a few frames. He's a big character and he does hit the ground pretty hard, but it also almost looks like he's flexing on you considering he's an arrogant king kind of archetype. That's so perfect. It's a really strong move and everything makes it feel like that. Well, except for the hit sound. That's another one I think should get that reverberating arena treatment, but I do really like K. Rool's vocalizations there. And I got to show the spike. I know it doesn't actually have anything to do with the move's animation, but it's so good. I'm shocked I got that first try. S tier. Obviously. The Plumber Squad, Dr. Mario, and Luigi too. Mario and Dr. Mario, the double kick itself, actually fairly satisfying to use, but funny enough, my favorite part of this animation is the wind back afterwards. You can see here that the double heel kick feels pretty nice, but that is just such a smooth transition back into the falling animation. I genuinely love that. It's smooth, but it's still a very visible, noticeable part of the animation. You know what I mean? It doesn't just sort of disappear into the background. It is a fairly prominent part of what you're watching Mario do, but it doesn't feel out of place or jarring. Landing animation is okay. He does hit the ground relatively hard, maybe a little bit of jumpiness on that arm considering how much he holds his arms out during that main pose. You can see here he actually stretches his arms quite a ways back, and you can see here that it gets snapped into a bent position, so it might have made a little bit more sense for him to catch himself with his arms still more above his head. It's okay though. And then Dr. Mario, slightly different frame data, but the fundamental animation is the same. And Luigi, again, pretty fundamentally the same. Now, the frame data on this one is substantially worse. I'm actually spamming back air as fast as I can here. Not great, but the fundamentals behind it, not really impacted. You can see here that it's really close to what the other two are doing. The only change that they did make, which is actually a change I really appreciate, is to the landing animation. Much clumsier. I like that. It fits Luigi. So I guess that kind of makes Luigi my de facto favorite of the three, but fundamentally I think they're all about the same and I think they're all pretty good. I feel like doing the rest of the Mario squad here. And Piranha Plant. Yoshi's tail flurry here. This is actually quite a strong kill move, but it does not feel like it. A lot of multi-hit moves suffer from that to some extent, but this one I'm always shocked at just how early it kills. You can see what I mean here. And a lot of tail sound effects in this game were given this like sharp piercing kind of quality, which I've never really liked. They sound out of place and they don't sound anything like what I would expect a tail swipe to sound like. I actually think the concept behind the move is fun and I like Yoshi's facial expression while he's doing it, but it just doesn't really suit what the move actually does. If this was not a kill move, I would get it a lot more. Landing animation I actually really like too. It's got a nice bounciness to it, nice bit of elasticity, and it almost looks a bit like a dog bedding down, which suits Yoshi really well. Peach and Daisy, the game claims that they're using their hips to attack here. This move is called Sky Hip, so if you say so. It does actually feel like it hits pretty hard. The issue is the heart effect gets in the way of a lot of the silhouette. So it's actually hard to tell just how forceful that animation feels. Landing animation for this one. Yeah, she does land very hard on her hips there, doesn't she? And then Daisy, same thing, except she's got the flower particle effect, which actually breaks up the silhouette even a little bit more than Peach's does. Bowser, I respect the commitment to making this essentially just an aerial smash attack is what I've usually heard it compared to. In a lot of ways, the attack does work really well from an animation perspective. His wide feet, you know, in reality, they would actually disperse the force behind this move a little bit more, which would make it less powerful, but they make the silhouette so much more impactful that it actually does, I think, work here. I do like how much he leans back. Again, I do like the feet. I feel like they could be maybe leaned a little further, as in his toes are bent a little bit more towards his head so that he's connecting with the heel more, but not bad. I don't love the arm posing, but at the same time, Bowser's kind of an awkward body shape. I don't really know what else you would do with them. Landing animation is very heavy, as it should be. This is Bowser throwing his full weight behind something, and Bowser's got a lot of weight to throw around. Obviously, this move feels good to hit with. Again, it's maybe one of the moves that I feel warrants the reverberating arena sound effect. I think the one they went with is pretty good, but I in particular feel that way about Incineroar and Bowser because they're characters that clearly have moves modeled after wrestling. And where does wrestling take place? A reverberating arena. Wario, weirdly animated character. This is definitely up there with some of his weirder animations, but I do kind of like it. It would feel really strange on a lot of characters, but it suits Wario in particular very well. He's literally hitting you with his back. It feels like this maybe shouldn't feel that forceful because he needs to abruptly halt all that momentum he builds up, but it does feel reasonably powerful somehow. Some of that is to do with Wario's excessive body braking, some of it's to do with some nice particle effects with the motion trails. Some of it's just to do with a lot of force generated in the initial animation. So yes, the fact that he can't follow through and do like a full flip or whatever, I do think makes the power a little less than it could be under some circumstances, but this is still working for me. Landing animation. What else could it be? Rosalina. I really like this swirling galaxy particle effect concept. I think it looks really good essentially all the time. And this animation also suits Rosalina's overall direction of very floaty and ethereal. Yeah, she's not even bothering to face in your direction. She's above all that. I really like that as well, actually. Focusing on Luma here. Really nice elasticity on this one. Actually sells that pretty well too. Very small body and not a ton of frames to work with it, but still does a pretty good job selling a sense of impact. And I like that floaty turn back into the neutral position too. Landing animation for Rosalina. Yeah, that looks kind of floppy. I know she's supposed to be sort of floating back up more than needing to really push herself back up, but that just looks a little strange to me. I was focusing on Rosalina there. I'm fairly sure Luma can't have a landing animation because that lunar landing tech is a thing, but yeah, okay, so Luma just continues on the attack no matter what. That's what I figured, because that's actually what lunar landing tech is. If you're not familiar with it, it's when Rosalina has her attack interrupted, but Luma's still comes out. I just wasn't 100% sure if it applied to all aerials. It looks like it does. Up air, forward air, down air. Okay, guess I'm not asking that question in any future episodes. There was actually something I forgot to bring up with the sound design here, so I think either of these attacks in isolation sound pretty decent. Or just Luma's. But it's when you connect with both of them and you get that thuddiness from Luma in conjunction with that more sparkly top end from Rosalina, that's when I think the attack sounds really good. It's a bit of additional positive feedback for landing the most powerful version of the attack you can. Bowser Jr. So if you caught that I'm wearing a different shirt in this one, funny story. This video got wrapped up, went out into early access, everyone reacted well. And then my Discord server told me that the entire Bowser Jr. segment I filmed was actually on his forward air. Every single input was forward air, every bit of commentary was on forward air, at no point in editing did I ever catch the fact that this was on forward air. Just the very first time I misinputted, my brain completely went along with it. So this new segment is being filmed the night before you see it. Yay! I like the concept for this one, and I also like how much momentum it looks like the ball carries. You can see that after the initial hit, it keeps traveling through and the entire body and cart move with it, because something that heavy should take some time to slow down and come to a halt. The startup is a little bit jerky. You can see it gets swung into that chamber pose a little bit unnaturally, but after it hits the chamber pose and the actual attack itself starts coming out, it looks pretty good from that point forward. They do cheat a little bit as well with scaling the ball down so that it will go back into the cart, but that's not something that you really pick up on. Landing animation for this one is definitely a little bit on the jerky side because of the way the cannonball travels. You can see from there specifically, it looks pretty good. I like how heftily the ball hits the ground. But there it just kind of disappears, and if you have it out a little bit too long and it starts to come back in, it almost snaps back into position. I love the sound of the cannonball waving through the air. And then it feels good to hit with too. Again, the ball imparts a lot of momentum, and I like the sound effect they chose. Piranha Plant. I actually really like the concept behind this move. The only issue for me is that it can be a little bit difficult to tell exactly what's going on at full gameplay scale and speed here. If I slow it down, it's much clearer that it's a fire breath attack. Cool idea, cool reference to the Mario series. Now, what I don't like about this one so much is the head movement. It rotates all the way around rather than thrusting into the attack. I'd prefer this one to work a little bit more like Rob's, and that could also apply to giving Piranha Plant a little bit of pushback on the move. I actually really don't know why this doesn't have any pushback. Intuitively, it really seems like it should to me. Actually just realized I had Rob on screen to compare it to. That wasn't planned. Landing animation. Looks pretty good there. What happens if you do it when the fire breath is in midstream? Yeah, holds up okay. I think there was a little bit of awkward snap. Yeah, you can see the breath snaps to Piranha Plant's head just a little bit, but doesn't look too bad. Yeah, full speed and scale, that's not really the kind of thing you're ever really gonna notice. And then hitting it feels pretty good. Decently heavy fire sounds. Yoshi, C tier. The concept is kind of fun, but nothing incredibly imaginative, and more than anything else, it just does not fit the role of the move at all. Peach and Daisy, in all honesty, they actually are pretty well animated for the most part. I really don't like that particle effect. B tier. Bowser, S tier, love landing that. Is it the most imaginative back air in the entire world? No, but it's executed really well and it feels so fun to use. Wario, S tier again, another one that feels really fun to use and it suits him in particular just perfectly. Rosalina, A tier, like a lot of stuff about that one. Bowser Jr., another A tier, some nitpicks with this one, but the concept's fun and it does feel pretty good to use. This segment was filmed for forward air, but I would actually give the same rating to back air too, so hey, bit of a preview for you for whenever the forward air episode comes up. And then Piranha Plant, I think I'm gonna go B tier on this one. I love the concept, but I do feel like they could have done a little bit more to make it better. And I just brought up Rob, so let's get him in there. See, this is what I consider to be the more fully realized version of Piranha Plants, and obviously the concepts behind them are a little bit different, but the jet of fire idea is still the same. Rob's body is oriented with the attack much more convincingly, and that recoil is a bit of a gameplay animation hybrid sort of deal, but it undeniably does make the attack feel more impactful. In Smash 4, the fact that the fire lingered so long was a little bit misleading potentially, but in Ultimate they actually remedied this by giving it a fairly prominent sour spot. Yeah, you can see it there. The landing animation here. Yeah. Suitable, very stiff, very mechanical, of course. And then the impact on this one's pretty good too. Yeah, heavy flame sound, and the default sound effect is a rocket propulsion sound. That sounds like it'd probably hurt. I think S tier, the concept's pretty fun and this one feels great. Ice Climbers. The Ice Climbers have an easiness to a lot of their attacks that this one does definitely fit into. Is that a good thing or not? This attack is relatively strong. But you also need to consider the fact that there are 2 climbers, so everything they do feels a little bit more impactful just because obviously you're getting hit by it twice. I think I'm okay with it. The Ice Climbers are definitely a little bit more of a floaty, lazy nature by design. You can see it in slow motion here. Not a huge amount of force behind the hammer swings. It's actually a bit hard to tell anything about the silhouettes with 2 of them though. Yeah, it comes through much better here. He puts the other hand on the head of the hammer, which almost looks like it's going to be sort of a help throw it motion, but it never really materializes. I don't know, it's maybe just a bit too lazy, even by the Ice Climber standards. You do have to consider that Solo Ice Climber is the single worst character in the game though, so having an animation that intentionally looks weak but then is bolstered just by virtue of having 2 copies of it, there is some logic behind that. And then the landing animation does actually eat it a little bit. Oh, that's something I actually hadn't noticed before. The Ice Climbers do handoffs like they're in a 2D game. Yeah, in sprite-based games that happens a lot because obviously they just want to be able to copy and paste the animations to both sides. It happens in some fighting games, but in Smash, most characters with weapons do not do that. Not tied into back air specifically, that's just something I've never noticed before, and I assume that means the animation reads essentially the same on both sides. Yeah, looks like it. I actually don't love that landing animation. It's a bit... You know what it looks like? It looks a little bit like the Family Guy flop to me. It's just a bit too sudden. And then gets up a little bit abruptly as well. It doesn't look that convincing. B tier, I guess. Basically the only thing saving this is the context it's used in. If this animation was not on a duo fighter, I think I'd be going like maximum C tier. Let's do the Shotos, Ryu and Ken. And Terry. And Kazuya. There we go. The 4 Shotos. These are going to be such a pain to test. I don't love this one. It does match Ryu's overall very stiff animation direction, and in fact it is a reference to Street Fighter, at least for Ryu specifically, but I don't know, it does look very stiff and a little awkward and cramped to me. Being a reference is always nice, but it doesn't mean I automatically have to love the move. I do like that it's a crescent kick, that's kind of cool. We don't see very many crescent kicks in Smash, the one that hits with the outside edge of your foot like that. Landing animation for this one, I like the concept behind it. You'll see he does a little bit of a foot sweep thing. It snaps into place a little bit awkwardly sometimes, though. I think I like it anyways. Always gonna get some bonus points with me for Street Fighter sound effects. And then Ken's is the same thing. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this is just a holdover from him being an Echo Fighter of Ryu. He does not actually use this move himself in Street Fighter. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think that's the case. And then Terry, this one does look pretty decent at speed. It's very much a hook kick, and Wait a minute. Why have I been reverse aerial rushing these every single time? I'm an idiot. Yeah, the thing I really like about this one is the follow through. He really commits to pivoting around it. Now, if you look at it at slower speed, closer up, you can see it actually does look a little bit cramped. His leg never fully extends all the way. I know this is, once again, kind of based on a King of Fighters animation, but there is something to be said for that. He gets a lot of power out of the distance he is traveling for what it's worth, but he's not traveling nearly as far as it could be. But if you're not looking at that too closely, I think there is enough else going on in this animation that it does still have a pretty good sense of power behind it. Landing animation does suit Terry pretty well, has a little bit of an action hero pose, and I love him putting his hand on his hat as he gets back up at the end. You can take that as him tipping his cap to you or just as vanity, maybe a bit of both. And then as with Ryu and Ken, custom sound effects. And as with Ryu and Ken, I really like them. Very distinctive from what you usually hear in Smash. And then Kazuya, we're back into very stiff territory here. It does match Kazuya and Tekken. Tekken animations, okay, if we're being honest, Tekken animation is not that great a lot of the time, so props for being faithful, I suppose. You can see the final pose is pretty good, but it doesn't look like he's projecting into it that well at all. There's not much of a snap across his entire body when the leg comes out. It's kind of an isolated motion, right? If I just showed you this kick, you may go, hey, that actually looks like a pretty forceful kick, but it's just getting to this point that's lacking a little bit. Landing animation, kind of a similar deal where the initial pose is pretty good, but then it has a bit of an unnatural quality to it afterwards. Look at it at full speed. It just looks a little keyframey, I guess is how I would describe it. It looks like suitable for Kazuya, fair enough, but I don't know. I think it seems a bit off. And then on hit, again, I do like the distinctive attack sounds. Now, like with all of Kazuya's moves, it's using Tekken hit lag. Hit lag is the time between when you hit an opponent and you're both frozen in place for a moment and then the opponent gets flung away. In Tekken, that time is very short compared to most fighting games, including Smash, so they did decide to replicate that here. But one of the reasons hit lag exists is to sell power, and this back air is supposed to be pretty powerful, and the hit lag does hurt it. Ryu and Ken, I'm gonna give B tier. Terry, that'll get a B tier for me as well. And then Kazuya's gonna go down in C tier, and honestly, the only thing even really lifting him up to this position is context. Like, if this animation was on essentially any other character in the roster, probably would be an F tier for me, but, you know, he is supposed to feel really stiff. I guess I can let it slide. Joker. If you take the root position of a character, like where he actually is hard-coded to be in space at all times, which the animation then plays around, it almost seems like at the very start of this back air, he goes off it slightly. That's probably not actually what's happening, but that's kind of the impression it gives me. It's like he's being jerked just slightly out of alignment for a moment, which is a bit of a shame because in every other respect, I like this one quite a bit. It's not the most insane concept in the world, but it does stand out a little bit from the rest of the pack. We haven't seen anything quite like this in Smash, and the entire arc that the blade follows is really smooth. I like how much the rest of his body joins into it. I love that he is just forming one complete diagonal line top to bottom at the end there. See what I mean? That final pose is just rock solid. And I also really like the Persona particle effects. Those look great, and back air I think is one of the moves that is better at showing them off. Particle effects get even more distinctive with Arsene. This is one of the moves that I think uses Arsene really well because you get the two alternate colored trails coming in from opposite sides. And the end result is this just kind of wall of damage coming at you. Joker using his dagger, Arsene using the knife hand strike. That all comes together really well. You know, I honestly think this might be the attack of Joker's I would say makes best use of Arsene because when you connect with it, and the hit lag makes those trails stay out for longer, it looks really substantial. Landing animation for this without Arsene is pretty good. Nice and poised, keep things under control. Joker is a very kind of suave character, makes sense to me. And then Arsene doesn't get a landing animation, he always just snaps back into idle stance, and you could argue that's a bit of a cop-out. You could argue it maybe makes things look a bit stuttery, but you could also say they're just always trying to portray Arsene as looming above the rest of the battlefield. I think it's okay. Hitting the attack by default feels fine. But when you bring Arsene into the picture, a whole bunch of Joker's moves get that reverberating arena sound effect, and you can see why I like it so much and want it to be used more because it adds so much to the sense of power a move has. It's one of my all-time favorite sound effects in the game. I cut Arsene out of the earlier episodes because he wasn't really doing anything to change my mind. For the record, I'm probably just going to include him in every episode moving forward because people kept asking about it, but this is one where I'd include him regardless because he really does make a difference to my impression of the move, and that impression is extremely positive. S tier. Let's get Pikachu and Pichu. Pikachu's is just kind of fun, and I like that really expressive pop on the last hit there. In Ultimate, they gave it some really nice motion smears, so it looks a lot more cohesive in comparison to some previous games. Yeah, I'm on board with this one. You can can see there's a lot of momentum with this one. Pikachu looks like he's having a great time the entire time. He's almost like chasing his tail a bit at the start and then that gleeful expression at the end. The landing animation. Now, this looks very good if you land in the middle of the move. That looks fantastic. I love how he continues the momentum again, and I think it looks much smoother than it did with Ryu and Ken. Now, the thing is, you can pop out of the end of the move and still hit that spinning animation. That's when I think it starts looking a little bit off. And this is the problem with only having time for one landing animation per aerial. Realistically, this should have two. But you know what? Here, it's not the absolute end of the world, and the payoff is that you can also get it under this context. And here, it's one of my favorite landing animations in the game. Because this looks great, even at full scale and speed, and is very noticeable at full scale and speed, which you can't say for all of these. But this, that still does look just slightly strange, right? But again, not too bad. There's a bit of a pop, though. It's another one of these back airs that isn't really a kill move and certainly doesn't feel like one. But I still actually think that's a lot of fun to use. Pichu, they maintained a similar concept but added that sparkling electricity all over the place, which is completely in line with Pichu's overall design concept. I actually really like that. It does definitely break up the silhouette though and makes the actual character animation itself a bit less appealing. You can see the concept behind them is pretty similar, except there's less joy in this one because this is one of the moves that hurts Pichu every time it uses it, so you're instead transitioning from fear and pain to looking pissed off at the end. And then Pikachu isn't doing that same kind of pronounced pop that Pikachu does at the end, so it looks much smoother in that context. Pikachu S tier, Pichu A tier. It's really just that extra little flourish at the end for Pikachu that really does it for me. It does cause a few more issues with his landing animation, but that's just such a nice touch. Obviously, I think Pichu's is pretty good too, though. And back later to finish this up, because at this point, it is officially too hot to be sealed away in an office recording all day. Link and Young Link, basically the same thing, and may as well just finish up the Zelda gang. Link, I never really loved this one, to be honest now. They did make a few concessions for him for Smash. Like this here, his neutral air, that isn't really something that he ever does in Zelda either, but at the very least, if he was going to be doing more like martial arts style moves, this fits him a little bit more. This, I don't know, it really just, it doesn't feel like Link to me. It doesn't help that this looks very awkward on both kicks to me. The first one's a little better. The second one, is he hitting you with the outside edge of his foot, almost like a crescent kick kind of thing, but just not done from the proper angles at all. His joints are bent weird. Yeah, this one's not really cutting it for me. This is the extension of the first kick. That looks all right. Full extension of the final kick, though, that just looks like it hurts. And if we're taking that body breaking thing into account again, it doesn't really get better when the move continues into more of the final pose. No. I think it works a little bit better on this side just because the silhouette is being broken up a little bit more by the shield and the quiver, and it's kind of disguising what the awkward knee joint movements look like, but not great either way. And then the landing animation, pretty straightforward. Again, there's two completely different kicks and they need to account for both of them with this animation. I think it works fine enough. I know Young Link was a clone character originally, but I still think the concept just inherently suits him a little bit more. You do see him being a little bit more athletic, particularly in Majora's Mask. This attack just fits into his portrayal a little bit better in my eyes. Even though the concept behind the moves has been carried over between the two Links, though, the animation has not, and I'm gonna say this one looks substantially better to me. His joints are not locked anywhere near as awkwardly because he's extending his legs out a lot more, and he's hitting with more sensible parts of the foot. You can see he's not doing the crescent kick, he's doing a proper roundhouse, and he's not holding that awkward part of the pose out either. So the entire thing just looks way more smooth and natural. Yeah, considering how similar the concepts behind these attacks are, the execution is just night and day to me. I think this one is not bad at all, actually. This is what I mean. Young Link is rotating in the opposite direction of Adult Link, but Adult Link for the second hit here, this could have been the heel or the ball of his foot rather than that awkward edge of his foot kind of deal. Young Link, this is just a straight up proper roundhouse kick, and I actually think it looks pretty good. And then the landing animation for the first hit, this is clearly what the move is based off of. It looks great there. On the second hit, you can see there's a bit of an awkward snap. Again, just a consequence of only having one animation to work with for a multi-hit move. Toon Link, I actually think this is a pretty smooth looking sword swipe, and it fits much more in Ultimate where it was repurposed into a combo tool compared to a kill move. And I like how exaggerated his pose is. You can see his legs are moving around a lot as well. Not that his legs necessarily have all that far to move, considering how short and stubby they are, but for what it is, like, yeah, this is working for me. Just one neat rotation throughout the entire thing. His entire body goes into it. I like the way that his body twists here. His head is leading the way, and then his torso kind of catches up to his head and arm after the fact. Looks Maybe a little bit strange at slow motion, but he's a cartoony character, so he gets away with it, generally speaking, more than a lot of other characters would. And at speed, I think it just makes the entire thing look very fluid. Landing animation for this one looks good, similar concept to Young Link, but because obviously there's no multi-hit aspect to this move, they could just account for it the entire time. Yeah, good stuff. I'm never gonna stop complaining about these sound effects though. It's so shrill my ears hurt. And then Zelda, I know it's become kind of a staple of Smash at this point, but I hate the concept behind this. It does not feel like a move that should be on Zelda whatsoever. It's kind of the Ganondorf principle, right? Where it's like, haha, funny Smash move. In this case, look how weak it is. Unless you connect the sweet spot, then look how strong it is. But the thing is, I'm not someone in the camp that says long-lasting, relatively well-known Smash moves shouldn't necessarily be changed, and this would be one of the first ones to go for me. The animation itself, for what it's worth, is fairly well done. I do like how much Zelda looks like she's putting her entire body into it, and that diegetic sweet spot indication with the sparkle particle effect. Okay, that's pretty good. So no real complaints from a technical perspective. The concept itself, though, just does not work for me and has not ever since Melee. Landing animation for this one is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. She does land relatively hard, but Magical Princess manages to keep a little bit of grace and poise in there too. Pretty good. Sound effect for the sour spot is obviously nothing particularly impactful. Sweet spot though. I do like that sound effect, not something a lot of moves get. Heavy, sparkly sound. Kind of hard to pull off. I think they did a good job. Link, F tier. I think the concept and the animation itself are both pretty bad. Young Link, B tier. Much more appropriate use for that concept. Toon Link, A tier. I may hate that sound effect, but other than that, it's a pretty memorable, fun take on that kind of sword sweep. And then Zelda, a very reluctant B tier. I want to put this one in C tier so bad, but I do need to acknowledge that the animation itself, for what it's worth, is well done, and some people will like the concept. Little Mac. This one's actually pretty hard to judge because it looks absolutely pathetic, but of course, it is absolutely pathetic, so you can actually say the animators did a pretty good job portraying that. By the way, I always need to judge Little Mac's animations from both sides because, as I noticed last episode, for some reason, his arms are two different sizes. Look at how much less muscular this side is compared to this side. I have absolutely no idea why they did that. Does it actually mean that I'm going to be changing anything about the animation judgment on either side? No. I'm gonna guess that's never gonna be the case, but just feels like something worth mentioning. Well, okay, there's also the fact that Little Mac is not an ambidextrous character. He always fights with his left hand facing you like a real right-handed boxer would, but that's not as fun. I actually do like how he tucks his legs up, like he really is trying to get at least a little bit of force out of this, but what can he really do? He's just a guy. Like, he's just a boxer. You wouldn't be able to get any kind of power out of this, so Little Mac can't get any kind of power out of this. I really like the landing animation for this one. It looks a little bit beleaguered, right? It's a heavy landing, and he looks almost a little bit stressed by it. He's not supposed to be up there, fair enough. Like I said, this is a very strange one to evaluate, but I actually think it's gonna go in A tier. It basically does exactly what it set out to do. Speaking of weird ones to evaluate, Mr. Game & Watch. There are obviously very few frames of animation on this one, but I really like the concept of sending a turtle out to do your work for you. Mr. Game & Watch in general actually has some of the coolest, most faithful references in the entire series baked into his animations. This is one of them. This really works for me. Starts out in the shell during the wind-up animation, that really nasty look on its face when it bites down. It's great. Landing animation, he actually goes back in the shell when he puts it away. That's kind of a cool touch too. Weirdly enough, there's actually a smooth 60 frames per second scaling down despawn on that one. A lot of item spawns don't do that, and Mr. Game & Watch almost never does that. I actually think another A tier. I really like this one. We got Snake floating off in space there. Snake's double kick here. Relatively simple concept, executed very convincingly though. He is hurling himself behind that. This move hits pretty hard, and it does feel like it. You can see that wind up there and just full extension, basically just a complete 90 degrees, about as much extension as you can possibly ask for from any character. That torqued pose is just so intense. You can see how much he's bent his legs up, and his arms too. His arms are stuck way out so that he can really rotate his shoulders. And then it all comes together, and that extension, this is a really convincing kick. He hits the ground quite hard here, and then that get up animation is smooth. Overall, I don't really think there's anything to complain about with this one from a technical perspective. The entire thing's handled perfectly. S tier, concept is pretty simple, but it's so convincingly done. Marth and Lucina, Roy and Chrom, and then I'll just run through the rest of the Fire Emblem characters too. Sword Sweep does feel pretty smooth with this one. Very simple, but simple is not necessarily bad. The one thing I'm a little on the fence about though is that forward air moves from top to bottom, back air moves from bottom to top, and yet back air is the stronger move between these, so it's got a little bit of that gravity problem again. That issue aside though, I think this does look very good overall. I really like the pose he ends up in. You can see it much more on this side. Very regal, very composed. A couple of Marth and Lucina's animations differ from each other. This is not one of them by the looks of it. I pretty much always prefer Marth's just because of the different particle effects indicating the tipper, but realistically it's kind of hard to imagine them ever not going in the same tier. Marth gets the more fun sound design too because of that Ragnall sound effect for the tipper. Love that. And then honestly, pretty much everything I said applies to Roy and Chrom as well. They've been relatively decloned from Marth and Lucina in a lot of ways. Back air, definitely one of the ones that holds over more. I think the sweet spot particle effects for Roy work reasonably well overall. They're not nearly as memorable or effective as Marth, I'm gonna say, but not bad. And then Roy was given a lot of moves in Smash 4 that use that reverse grip, but back air is not one of them. You can see he just holds his sword in the more conventional grip the entire time. And then that means that Chrom, who does not use the reverse grip, did not need to have this move adapted. As you can see, pretty much exactly the same. I think Chrom might put his sword just slightly higher up than Roy. Even then, is he? I know you can see more of Chrom's face than Roy's face, but I think some of that's just camera angle and the fact that Chrom doesn't have a shoulder pad on there. It's honestly really hard to tell. Obviously, this is not going to change my ratings between them. It's just a curiosity thing at this point. And as with Roy, Marth gets the sweet spot mechanic, which automatically makes his sound design a little bit more interesting than Chrom. As you'd expect, 4 extremely similar characters, and that even applies to their landing animations. They're pretty much exactly the same. Ike, this is a very, very powerful back air. I'm gonna say it's actually a little more powerful than the animation lets on because he's got that problem again where he just completely halts all his momentum out of nowhere. And it's really unnecessary because this move doesn't have a lingering hitbox or anything like that. So if this was just carried over into a smooth spin to finish up, I think that would actually make the animation work a bit better for me. Now, the pose he ends up in at the end is not bad by any means, but momentum is power, and it doesn't look like this move has that much momentum. There's very little wind up either. I know he doesn't have a ton of frames to work with, but that's actually... that's not great. He's not pulling his arm back that far. And again, this is a beast. This move hits very hard. And it looks surprisingly average. Honestly, really the only thing indicating how heavy the attack is just the large sword. It even extends over to the sound effect. This is another one of Ike's strongest kill moves, which means this is another time where I get to complain about how much better it used to sound back in Brawl. In Brawl, by the way, they also managed to get the animation aspect of it better because you can at least see him controlling the sword somehow. Generally speaking, I would say move portrayals have progressed really well as the series has gone on, but with some of Ike's stuff, I don't think he meets that. This doesn't necessarily feel bad to hit with, but I think it should feel better. Landing animation is pretty ordinary. Ike manages to stay fairly under control, which is sort of similar to, say, Charizard in the sense that, yeah, if you can control the sword a little bit more, that does mean that you're opening yourself up to maintaining a bit more of a poised landing. He's also generally portrayed as a very skilled character overall, like a very, very skilled sword fighter, so I wouldn't necessarily be expecting him to hit the ground too hard. Robin, this concept works really well for me, not so much with the bronze sword, but generally speaking, Robin is a tactician kind of character and has a magical sword, so you can see that when the 11 sword comes up here, it looks a little bit more like you're letting the sword do some of the work for you, which of course is exactly the case. And I think it actually plays out pretty well here. Robin is not as physical as some of the other Fire Emblem characters, so it would make sense for them to look a bit more unbalanced, and also maybe just looks like they're trying to protect the book a bit. Byleth, I think this overall animation is good. There is one thing on here that's admittedly pretty petty, and that's that if you're finally giving us a spear character after all these years, please have them stab. Don't have them just whipping the spear around like it's a sword on the end of a stick. Like, let's actually get some proper spear animations, but having gotten that out of my system, the move does look like it's hitting pretty hard. The fact that the spear abruptly halts its momentum is not as big a deal as it is on, say, Ike, because you can see the spear shaft is actually colliding with Byleth's back there. Pose at the end is really strong. Byleth winds into it convincingly. Now, what would make this attack look even stronger is if the spear was allowed to go out further. That would generate more momentum, but it's a balancing thing, I get that. Landing animation on this side, kind of the same thing where the robes turned it into a bit of a mess, but on this side, I actually think it looks pretty cool. Very strong, distinct pose. Marth, Lucina, Roy, Chrom, all solid B tiers. Ike, sadly need to give this one a B tier as well. It's a fun move to use. I'd like to put it higher, but with a better animation, it would be more fun to use. Robin, I think, gets an S tier. That's a great use of the 11 sword. And then Byleth, I think, A tier. There are spear moves that I like more, but still overall very memorable back air compared to a lot of the other Fire Emblem characters, and it hits very hard. Simon and Richter, same animation for both these guys, the only back air that you can angle like this. Now, looks good in a lot of ways. It's got the very unfortunate side effect where if you fast fall in the middle of the move, for example. The whip can't really react convincingly to that. Its physics are locked because obviously it needs to portray a consistent hitbox the entire time. There was no way around that. The launch out with it does feel pretty good though. On the upwards variant here, that one, I like the line that Simon's body follows there. You can see how coherent the silhouette is. His torso is bent back a little bit to put more power into the move. Similar thing with the neutral variant. That one's actually working for me too. And then the downward variant actually does it again for me. Now, I think the upward variant is the most cohesive of any of them, but I don't think he's got a bad one in the bunch. Still a nice sense of alignment between everything there to make it look like the power's being directed the right way. As with a lot of Simon's animations, if you look at the whip coming back in afterwards, it does look a little bit jumpy and out of place. Yeah, sure, that's not fantastic at this particular speed and scale, but at actual gameplay speed and scale, that is just not even an issue. Landing animation for this one, it's okay. I wish the whip did something a little bit more natural looking. You can see it's kind of jumping around a bit all over the place there, depending on when I land with the thing. On this side, that even shows up a little bit more. That might be another one of those things that doesn't actually show up at all at full gameplay speed and scale, though. Actually, I take that back. You can see that it does look a little flaily here. Okay, not fantastic on the landing. And then the sound design for these. So the more 8-bit tipper whip sound effects, they've grown on me over time, and they do make the move sound distinct. I'm not convinced they don't take away from it a little bit, but that's mainly just because there's less focus placed on the more naturalistic whip sounds, which I think are fantastic, some of the better sound design in the game. Yeah, I think S tier for these look great, sound great. Greninja, and might as well just do the rest of the Pokemon here. Lucario and Mewtwo. Greninja, it feels a little bit plain to me. It doesn't feel incredibly strong, but it's not an incredibly strong move, so the multi-hit nature is actually okay there. This will kill, but it's not like the killing back air to end all killing back airs. Still just feels kind of plain. I feel like it's missing some water particle effects or something like that. That would be a nice welcome addition. Set of rapid kicks does suit Greninja well enough, and you can see it's decently animated, but even at slow motion, it's still just really hard to read anything distinct from it. It does look really fast, and Greninja is a ninja character, and the very final pose he goes into is pretty strong. And it is a relatively distinctive back air. We don't see a whole lot of stuff that looks like this, but the word I just keep coming back to is plain. Landing animation, I don't understand why he's not putting a hand down there. I suppose this is to make Greninja look very balanced, but if his default pose involves a hand on the ground, and a lot of characters, they only put a hand on the ground when they're doing their landing animation, it just seems like a bit of a weird call. This doesn't look bad, don't get me wrong, but it's just a bit different than what I'm used to seeing. Lucario, I like this one, and I really like what they did in Ultimate, giving it that really prominent blast of aura energy. I do wish that blast changed appearance alongside his aura, though, so you can see his more standard aura particle effects here that he always has on him. They change as he builds damage, and they actually blow his hair, I guess that is. I'll call it hair back. Whereas back air, here's 0%, and here's 999%. They don't do anything with it. I'm not saying it necessarily needs to get bigger, but having it more ragged or something like that would be cool. I love Lucario's ending pose here, and I also really love how much he winds up into it and how quickly that pose comes out at the end. Look how snappy that is. I'll switch stages to show off the landing animation here. Now, he does hit the ground hard. He almost hits the ground slightly too hard. The move does look pretty powerful, but if you look at it in the air, he's not leaning into it that much in terms of his entire body going horizontal. The power of the move is more sold from how snappy the actual output itself is. Yeah, that's giving me some vague Family Guy flop vibes again. It's just a bit much. It looks good, but I feel like this is better suited to an attack that was maybe leaned over a bit more. The sound design does change very slightly with aura levels. No aura, and then max aura. More than anything else, it just lingers a little bit longer. I do feel like they could have been a bit more bold with that, but it helps that I like that sound effect. Another one that I feel like not necessarily should get that specific Ganondorf neutral air reverberating arena sound effect, but you know, maybe some kind of reverberation effect of some kind, because this does functionally turn into, I think, the strongest back air in the game. If it's not the literal strongest, it's gotta be way up there. And then Mewtwo, I hate this one. This looks so stiff to me, and it doesn't help that this is a kill move, and yet it looks very, very limp. So you've got just this really lazy looking swat that will absolutely wipe someone out. And on top of that, the only part of it that looks like it might have some real momentum behind it is the very tip of the tail, and that's the sour spot. Now, admittedly, that's not the animator's fault, but it's certainly not making me like the move anymore. Now, you might say, well, Mewtwo's just that powerful in the Pokemon series, so lazy swats are all you need to do, or, oh, he's enhancing his attacks with psychic energy or something along those lines. Well, okay, if that's the case, then why don't any of his other tail attacks do that? The rest of these all look fine. I do think you could make that more lazy effort concept work, but you need to put some consistency behind it. As is, this just looks like an animation that's off compared to the others. I do like the arms crossed thing. That's a pretty cool pose. That's about all I can really say about it though. Even the landing animation's not great. It's not awful either, but he pops back just a little bit unnaturally. Again, I know he is probably lifting himself up with psychic energy on this one. That's kind of the implication they're likely going for, but it's not that smooth. Definitely F tier from Mewtwo. A couple years back, I called that the worst back air animation in the game. I might still stand by that actually. Greninja B tier, mainly just because it's a bit more memorable compared to a lot of other kick moves. I don't think it has that much else going for it. And then Lucario S tier, love that one. Pac-Man, and well, we're here, let's just get the rest of these kicks wrapped up. There's way too many of them in the game. Ness, Lucas, Wii Fit Trainer, and Bayonetta. Sadly not King DDD anymore. That is the one kicking back air I will cry over. Pac-Man, relatively simple and straightforward double kick, but I do like that little bit of bounce and floatiness he gets while still maintaining actually a decent sense of force generation behind it. One detail that you're probably not going to focus on, but is a little bit weird if you're hyper-focusing on it like this, he kind of opens and then closes his hands immediately again, and it almost makes me think he's doing like a crab motion. It's just so unnecessary. Like, I know it's not actually a big deal and no one was possibly thinking this before I pointed it out here, but it just looks a little bit goofy now that I have noticed it. It's pretty prominent even at full gameplay speed and scale. Ah, Sponge Boy, me bob. But other than that, yeah, he does get a good amount of power out of them. I like how much he leans back into it. Landing animation has a satisfying bit of bounce to it too. Now, the pickup animation, a little bit unnatural maybe. It doesn't look like there's nearly enough weight being put on Pac-Man's arm there, but relatively minor detail. Wii Fit Trainers. This falls right into Wii Fit Trainers' usual trappings of no particle effects, you know, no motion smears, no interesting trails of any kind, no body breaking. It's just the most bare bones, Spartan set of animations in the game. It's a decision I don't fully understand to this day. Even the core of the animation though, it's not a bad idea, but you see the legs are a little bit incoherent. They're not like fully extended and they're not together particularly far. You kind of can think of the toes as acting like a spear, but it's more like a couple of little spears that are hopefully both hitting the other person. Obviously, there's a lot of horizontal lean, which is a good way to sell a sense of power, but why is the back arched upwards here? If those feet are doing a lot of damage, that means they should be thrusting out with a lot of force, which means they should be carrying the entire body with them. The closer they are to the feet, the more the body's going to be carried, which means the entire thing should be flattening out into a horizontal line. I know this is the yoga pose, the cobra pose. I'm on record as saying I'm not particularly impressed by Wii Fit Trainer's gimmick, and this is yet another instance where having to stick to it is actually harming the move. Even the landing animation, it looks like this might be designed to look like a yoga pose as well, but it is just way too snappy. Yeah, the legs are not in that position whatsoever. Ness. Pretty convincing looking double kick again. Now, Ness is a character where I'm generally very impressed by his particle effects. This is one move that I don't necessarily feel needed. It does tie well into his overall concept of he puts his body behind the attack, but it's really magic that's doing, or I guess PSI energy, whatever you want to call it, that's doing a lot of the work. But this breaks his silhouette up a little bit. The attack looks forceful enough that I'm not sure it's needed. His forward air, something like that, that feels very sensible. Up air, sure, fair enough. In fact, basically, of all the aerials in his kit, this is the only one I think it feels kind of out of place. Maybe downer a little bit, but even then. There is definitely some nice coherency with all of his aerials using that same particle effect, so fair enough, I suppose, but maybe you can make an argument for that not being entirely necessary. But again, despite being such a small character, it is a reasonably convincingly powerful kick. Now, it doesn't travel quite straight back. You can see there's a little bit of an arc there, which is robbing it of a bit of momentum. That's actually something the particle effect helps cover up at full gameplay scale though, so I suppose maybe there's your argument for having it. Landing animation is pretty routine overall. I do like the extra little bit of shuffling he does to help himself get up. That looks pretty nice. Lucas, very interesting concept for a back air. I do like that it's one of the, again, very rare spiking back airs in the game. There's not really a great visual indicator of exactly where that's going to happen on the move though. I love the consistency with his hexagonal particle effects and I think they look pretty good here. If you take them away and just focus on the character animation itself, it still works for me. It does not look particularly forceful despite the fairly nice looking flip into it. It's okay the actual kick itself does not look that powerful because, again, he's not actually directly attacking you, he's using the PSI energy to do it. Do I wish that it had the powerful kick in addition to that? It would be better. I would say that's an improvement, but it's okay. Landing animation, a bit on the snappy side. That was inevitable to a degree, especially if you're going to be a character landing on your head like that. What does it look like closer to the end of the move? Yeah, that's clearly more the point it was designed for. For Bayonetta, I love those particle effects. I think those look so great on essentially every move that uses them. This attack, it's a little bit hard to judge because she has very, very like unnaturally long legs, and this move is needing to take those legs fairly far, fairly quickly. Still gonna say it looks a little bit slow compared to the amount of force put into it, but Bayonetta is a character you can argue that she's maybe unnaturally strong, so she doesn't need to put nearly the same degree of force into it. Do I necessarily love that? No, this move did need to be a bit of a slower take on this kind of backwards kick, but what they could have done is just have more time go into the wind-up and less time into the extension. Bayonetta does have a bit of this easiness to more of her moves though, and it does come from the Bayonetta series, so I feel like if you were going to give this to one character, she's one of the ones I think can justify it a little bit more. Pretty strong, convincing pose on this one. It's Bayonetta, you generally expect that, and she does have some decent wind-up. Compared to some of her moves, this is not the most committal you'll see from her, but it's pretty good. The kick does go almost straight back, which does give it a bit of an extra sense of power. And I think a lot of her animations are probably designed with an eye towards helping that hold the gun out function work properly, and with this one, it does fit very well. The landing animation for this one, very heavy. It needs to be because Bayonetta actually has her landing leg increased depending on how much she's done before she hits the ground. It works. Pac-Man, pretty standard B tier. Ness, B tier as well. That particle effect is really the only thing making it stand out from a lot of these other very standard double kicks. You could also argue that's a bit of a detriment, it hurts the silhouette. You could also argue it helps the silhouette and you like the consistency between all of his aerials, so I'll average it out here. Lucas, I'm actually going to give a B tier to as well. It's a memorable back air for sure, but it's a bit on the messy side, and again, that visual indication of where the spike is not really that good. Lucas has custom particle effects, right? They could put one in there if they wanted to. Wii Fit Trainer F tier, I hate that one. And Bayonetta A tier, she's got very stylish moves overall. It's not her most stylish move, but it's done reasonably well, and I think what's pushing it over the top for me is the gun extension that fits really nicely on this move. Olimar. I don't understand how this keeps happening with Olimar. This isn't a case where I need to be complaining about the fact that the Pikmin work the way they do, meaning that they don't look like they generate enough power, or that too many moves share similar concepts so they're confusing to read from a gameplay perspective. It's not a case where his tiny body and the frames dictated by gameplay force the animation to be a bit insubstantial and overly rushed, and yet it still, even freed from those constraints, just does not look that good. It kind of reminds me of, say, Toon Link's back air minus any of the charm in the animation and also the context, because Toon Link's back air was not a kill move, this is, and yet it still just feels so light and inconsequential. I don't understand why Olimar keeps getting stuck with bad animations. I know it's not always supposed to be a kill move. I've got three Pikmin here, the blue and the white, which are not intended to kill particularly effectively. But then you've got purple, and purple Pikmin is just a monster of a move. But the thing is, notice anything about the animation between all of these? It's the same. For all three of them, it just feels so casual. There's no real weight behind it, and I'd even be willing to say that it looks relatively smooth for what it is. I like the arc the Pikmin travels in afterwards. Yeah, it snaps back into position a little bit awkwardly, but that's more of a gameplay functionality thing. You can say the same thing with Olimar. The spin he travels in actually looks fairly nice. It's also one of the absolute plainest landing animations across the entire roster, which fits in considering Olimar isn't putting any kind of force behind it, so why should he need to catch himself in any kind of serious way? Doesn't make me feel good about it. I don't understand it. Once again, a completely different class of animation than what we've looked at so far, and once again, just looks straight up bad. Min Min. Not actually really a move that you see thrown out a whole lot, considering what it's functionally supposed to do is just let you use forward air from the other side. Min Min does have two different variations of the animation with each arm though, and they do need to account for that and make sure that they look smooth either way, and you also need to account for three different arms, each of which has their own speed, and I think, technically speaking, it's well done. So I can just throw out her left arm, or I can just throw out her right arm, or I can throw out one and then at any point have the other one come out too, and you can see they've accounted for it pretty well with the way her shoulders shift around. She ends up in much more of a neutral position afterwards. So it's very smartly handled, and then on top of that, I think each individual one looks very good. I like the pose with the other unused arm up, ready to strike at any point. Automatic turnarounds animation is a bit weak half the time, though. It makes sense from a gameplay perspective because Min Min is not a character who wants her back facing you, generally speaking, so you can see if I land with an arm out, I just automatically flip around when I hit the ground. And with that arm, it's fairly smoothly done. With the other arm, though, much more of a jarring snap to it. That one doesn't look as good. And then, of course, you need to account for the other arms as well. It doesn't change anything about the fundamentals of the animation, but I love this coming off and going back here. That looks so nice. The Megawatt arm, I'm gonna say, it's a little bit too slow to really convincingly portray how powerful it is. I know that's a gameplay balance thing as well, and I know it's kind of a wrecking ball-like force that can push through you to an extent, but even taking those into account, just judging it on an animation basis, I'm not going to say I absolutely hate it, because again, I do get why it works the way it does. You need more time to react to it, but it's also the more devastating one, and the slow speed lets it cover a broader area. But purely if we're limiting this to a discussion of making the best possible animations work, it's lacking a little bit. This one has some of the best technical execution in the game, but it does have the issue with the Megawatt, and on top of that, Min Min just kind of has a bunch of moves that sort of bleed into each other, and back air is part of that. I know that's the character's design, but again, strip all that away and just go purely trying to make the best animations possible. That is knocking a little bit off of it, so I think A tier. It's got a lot of good stuff going for it too. It would be very memorable outside of the context of Min Min's kit, but we are in the context of Min Min's kit. Hero. Pretty straightforward sword swipe, all things considered. This is very powerful. It's not nearly as powerful as the windup would have you think. That's more just a matter of balancing Hero out. You know, he's got that powerful magic, so they don't want his aerials to be too spammable compared to some characters. It pulls it off, and that's despite the arc traveling from bottom to top again, and the full windup not really going into making the sword attack look as powerful as possible. It's a good windup, don't get me wrong, but you can see it's more just him sort of taking his time to complete it rather than looking like he's coiling up some unimaginable amount of power. Final pose he ends up in here does look really cohesive and strong though. The landing animation for this one, all things considered, pretty straightforward. Watch it on this side too. Yeah, I like the way he holds the shield. Not a whole lot else to comment on there. B tier, apart from the exceptionally bad frame data, it's a completely run-of-the-mill sword move. The Kirby Squad, Meta Knight, and DDD always had a bit of a soft spot for this one. Now, I will admit, when you're not connecting with it, it does just kind of look like mush. I feel like they could have used some much more persistent and much more prominent particle effects, some nice motion smears, and that could have gone a long way to showing this up. The thing about this one, though, is when you do connect with it, I love the way the multi-hit lag plays with that one. Suddenly it makes it feel very substantive. I'm just gonna do it one more time. Suddenly, that feels like an extremely hard-hitting move, and I've criticized some other moves in the past, like Cloud's forward smash, for having too much hit lag on it. This one in particular, though, I really like it. It makes this really nice rhythm, and I like Meta Knight's vocalizations, too. Yeah, it feels like a really satisfying back air to connect when you do that. And then you look at it in slow motion and we're kind of back into mush territory. He's just spinning so fast and needs to throw out so many attacks in so few frames that there's not really enough time for this move to have much of an identity. Landing animation. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. He could be landing with his body rotated in any direction, but the thing is, he's spinning so fast that you can't even really keep track of where he's facing, so I don't think that actually causes a lot of jumpiness with this one at all. DDD, third game in a row where he's gotten a new back air animation. Now, this one is mostly just to clean up the hitbox inconsistencies from Smash 4. Smash 4, they gave him this very vertical arc, even though the hitbox only matched a fraction of that. They could have just buffed the hitbox. I don't think that would have been unwarranted on DDD, but you know what? Fair enough. It's technically consistent. I like that. I actually like the back air overall. Feels very smooth and it's got a nice sense of momentum behind the hammer. It's moving pretty fast and DDD spins with it. I really like the landing animation for this one too. It does not particularly match what he's doing. In fact, it doesn't really match what he's doing at all, but I don't particularly mind in this case. It fits DDD so well. I'm willing to forgive some pretty horrible snapping animations as long as a move can make me laugh, which this one does. It's one of the very few landing animations where even at full speed and scale, you really tend to pick up on it a lot. Part of the reason for that is because of how exaggerated it is. And I love DDD's hammer sound effects too. Yeah, that feels so good. Meta Knight, I think B tier. I might be willing to go A, in particular if it had better particle effects, but as is, while it feels great to connect with, it just doesn't really have that much identity or really anything to latch onto if you don't connect with it. DDD though, easy S tier. Mega Man. This one looks pretty cool. It's another one where I'm gonna say the power that it puts out as a kill move does not really match up to the animation. The animation really does not put off too much of it at all, but Mega Man, based on a lot of his sprite work from earlier games, I'm not necessarily sure that's always the right call to make, but accepting that context, I do understand him having some stiffer animations, and it is a cool reference to the Mega Man series. I think those multicolored particle effects look really good too. Very simple, but if you slow it down, you can see the tricoloring going on there. Yeah, that's nice. Landing animation on this one actually matches the move pretty well. It's nothing crazy, but it is a somewhat distinct pose that feels very natural with the way the move works, and I like that smooth turnaround at the end there too. A tier, Inkling. Comes out very quickly, but it still doesn't necessarily look like it's got that much force behind it. You can see it pauses for a moment and then goes into actually a pretty nice smooth transition back to the landing state. Or falling state. Actually, I really like that transition. That's very smooth. This entire thing is very smooth, even if there's not a whole lot of force behind it. Comes through a little more in slow motion. I like that kick with his front foot. Admittedly, it doesn't come through on this side particularly well. His body's kind of blocking it, but on this side, it does portray that kind of extreme sports feel that the Inklings seem to be channeling fairly well. Nothing particularly interesting about the landing animation for this one. I will say the gun does not look sturdy enough for the beating it's taking on the ground there, but considering, I guess, what you're doing with this move to begin with is cracking someone over the head with it, clearly the engineers behind it have to be doing something right. I think A tier just matches the character's overall aesthetic and moveset design so well. And now we're just down to blades. So Steve actually has two back airs. He's got the conventional back air, that pickaxe swipe, but he's also got this thing. I think that was probably just designed to add some extra consistency to his jab and to his forward tilt if you want to use them in the air like that, but you can manipulate it to essentially have an extra set of aerials, and a backwards variant was added for consistency. So for all intents and purposes, Steve just has two completely separate variants of forward air and back air. This back air, I actually don't like it all that much. It's very stilted even by Steve's standards, and it does not look anywhere near as powerful as it is. This is a ridiculously strong back air. The animation just does not portray that at all, especially with Diamond. Absurdly powerful, and yet this just looks like too casual, almost a slap. This one, on the other hand, this looks surprisingly fluid by Steve's standards. Nice, snappy, almost flick of the wrist feel to it. I don't even know if Steve has wrists. Obviously, there are a few different materials to work with. I'm just looking at them as we go here. So, standard back air. Yeah, you can see, I know it's a stylistic choice for Steve to have these stilted animations, but that really just looks awkward to me. Travel arc looks awkward. He's not holding his arm up nearly as much as he could. It's already clipping horribly into his head, so why not just go a little bit more extreme with it so it at least feels like there's a bit more of a proper wind-up. This one, again, actually looks surprisingly good. A nice bit of circular arm rotation there. Not breaking anything to do with that fundamental principle of he needs to have a completely straight arm. I just think it's put to way better use here. I do like the landing animation for the pickaxe, getting stuck in the ground and putting about as much of a bent over animation as Steve can possibly manage. It does look fairly weighty. And then the sword swipe doesn't even really have a landing animation just because of how you're intended to use it. C tier. I do kind of like the sword, but realistically the pickaxe is the way more prominent and important part of it, and I think a lot of Steve's other moves have gotten around those limitations way better than back air has. I didn't really set out planning to make this the Kingdom Hearts crowd, but I guess that's where we are now. Sora. This one absolutely has the problem that a lot of back airs I've gone over have. The animation does not properly show off the power whatsoever. I can definitely forgive it with Sora more than a lot of characters because essentially all of his animations look like this. It was very obviously a stylistic choice. The animators are doing this on purpose. Does that mean I automatically forgive it for everything? No, actually, and there are some other issues with this one too. It's using custom Kingdom Hearts sound effects, and generally speaking, when you port over sound effects from a Game Zone series, that's much more often than not a good sign to me. In this case, though, that just does not feel very strong at all. Yeah, I do like the custom particle effects, though, the stars. Only Sora gets those. And those are a cool touch. Everything else about this animation I actually really like too. It's so smooth. This is one of the smoothest arcs that any character travels in with their back air. It's a shame that it's kind of too slow to convey what the move's going for. It might have just been smarter to make this not a particularly powerful back air, but the trade-off to that slowness is that the arc does come through more effectively, and it matches Sora's overall extremely floaty jumps as well. Looks very elegant and graceful. I love the spin he does at the end. Again, I think the best thing to do would just be to not make this a killing back air. Unfortunately, as you can see, it is. The landing animation for this one's a little bit weird to me. It is exaggerated, which fits a lot of what Sora is going for, but he hits the ground surprisingly hard. Sora is an extremely floaty character. That does not look like a particularly floaty landing. I'm kind of torn on this one. I gotta consider the context. I would definitely be docking it a lot harder on most other characters. Undeniably has some pretty significant issues with it though, even if I do like the stylization. B tier, Sephiroth. This would be a pretty memorable back air just from range alone, but on top of that, it's got some of the best anticipation and payoff of any back air I can think of. Really, I can't think of a lot of other moves that would compare to this. That long escalating wind-up into almost instant gratification, and that really satisfying ending pose, very snappy sound effect too. Love that blade sound and then hitting someone with it. Sour Spot is okay, but hitting them with the sweet spot, this I think is about as good as that heavy blade sound ever gets. It feels just perfectly suited to this move. I love how intense the posing is on this, and black particle effects for a sword. I know it's edgy, I know it's over the top, I don't care. I think that is the coolest thing. On this side, it even reads a little bit better because then the ending smears are in front of Sephiroth. I love the little sword flip to get back into Sephiroth's idle stance too. That's something they obviously needed to account for with a lot of his moves. That idle stance is kind of necessary because of how ridiculous the sword is, and it looks as good here as it ever does. Surprisingly natural considering how intense the motion is. You don't really question it. Then the landing animation for this one, not too much to say here. Not completely out of control. Not too poised either. I really like the one wing form here. The hair and the wing come together to almost make it look like two different colored wings for Sephiroth. S tier. Love this one. And then finally Cloud, which is definitely one of the most notorious back airs in the competitive scene because Spargo is just so infamous for using it to great effect, and it's just a nasty move to begin with. This animation is just smooth as butter. I love the arc. I love the green particle effects. Those look great all over the place. I love the easy transitions. Check out the handoff he does here. Starts off more in the clothed arm, ends up more in the bare arm. Just a completely fluid motion. The arc is traveling up more than down a little bit, but it's way less extreme than I've criticized some other moves for. It maybe robs the move of a slight bit of feeling of power, but not too much. The wind up into it's pretty nice too. He pivots back quite far. Sound effects for this one are a bit of a mixed bag. I love the sword swinging sound. I think it sounds incredibly appropriate for the Buster Sword. The custom Final Fantasy hit sounds I think are going to be a bit more of a personal preference thing. I have no nostalgic attachment to Final Fantasy VII whatsoever, and to my ears they sound way too swishy and not as strong as they should. But they definitely do stand out from the pack. You can't really argue against that. Landing animation looks pretty good. It also looks exactly how I'd expect a spiky-haired JRPG protagonist to land. And ending strong, Cloud is joining Sephiroth up in S tier. And there you go, the back air animation tier list. Happy summer. I'm gonna go jump in some ice water. Thanks for watching, everyone, and let me know what you thought of the list. Likes and comments are a huge factor YouTube uses to decide if a video should be passed around to more people, so if you think this one deserves it, much appreciated. You can see the previous episode of this series above. There's a video from my main channel, MockRock, below. And patrons, YouTube members, and Twitch subs get perks like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.